A poor grandma and grandpa. Here were two people who had spent the majority of their life making major purchases like houses and cars and land with nothing more than a handshake in their promise. And why not? I mean, everyone knew that above all else, they were painfully honest. As far as they were concerned, people were only as good as their word. And trust me, their word was good. So why? After living in the same town for 40 years, were people suddenly asking them for their ID? They knew who they were. But they'd go to the grocery store and write a check, and somebody would say, "May I see your ID, please?" And Grandma would mutter, "I've only been shopping here most of my life." I remember the first time Grandpa was asked for his ID when he went into the bank. It made him mad. He shook his head and he said, "What is this? Are we living in a world where no one trusts anyone?" I mean, what kind of a world is it anyway? That was almost 30 years ago. If Grandma and Grandpa were confused then, how do you think they'd feel now? I mean, even our ID isn't good enough because everybody's stealing it. Can't carry your Social Security card around, can you? And if anybody asks you for an ID, it better have your picture on it. Current. And some places, it's not even one piece of current ID now, it's 2 or 3. Identity fraud, it's commonplace. And what about all the consumer fraud? How many businesses think nothing of paying their CEOs great severance wages by taking it away from the common workers' retirement account? And how many people think it's perfectly okay to go in and take something from a business because they make enough money anyway? What's the harm? Fraud, dishonesty, it's all around us. And for the most part, we think very little about it. But you know what's interesting? According to a recent survey, when employers were asked for the one characteristic they seek the most in their new employees, guess what it was? Honesty. And when they asked people who were looking for jobs what kind of a company they wanted to work for, guess what their answer was? An honest one. And you know all those date.coms? Well, guess what the number one characteristic is that people list when they're looking for a future mate? Honesty. You know, it seems like maybe the majority of people have finally had it with deceit and deception. But before we breathe a sigh of relief, I think we better take an honest assessment of ourselves. We need to ask ourselves a few questions. I mean, how committed are we to speaking and hearing the truth? And are we willing to remember that there is a difference between speaking the truth and using the truth, especially using it for our own purposes? It's an easy trap to fall into. Now, the Pharisees, they They were committed to speaking and upholding the truth. Their entire lives were organized around that. They knew the laws. The scriptures tell us that when they bought a piece of herb in a store in the marketplace, they would even count the leaves and make sure that they tithe their tenth. I mean, these people were honest, right? And they taught the laws to others. They wanted them to know them. But do you want to know why they wanted them to know them? So they knew when they weren't keeping them. Because there was no way common folk could keep all the laws. So as they pointed out to others when they were transgressing the laws, they were simply building themselves up a little higher. They hadn't even noticed what they were becoming. They didn't see that because of their own high standards that they had created for themselves, that the poor were actually being abused, that they were having to pay a higher percentage of their income in order to support the Pharisees and the lifestyle they had become accustomed to. It was all in the law. It was okay. While they enforced the truth to others, the one thing they were unwilling to see was how it related to them. Jesus, on the other hand, wasn't quite so willing to gloss over the situation, was he? As a matter of fact, in today's gospel lesson, he'd had it. And this resulted in what at first appears to be an attack on the Pharisees. I mean, come on, let's face it, you brood of vipers was not exactly a term of endearment. And as for the remark concerning their overall cleanliness, I mean, can you feel the sting and the embarrassment of that comment? And so, when I read this passage, I wonder, is this truth-telling at its best or at its worst? It depends. Did Jesus say it to hurt them? To put them down? You know, knock them down a few pegs? Put them in their place? Or did he say it to instruct them? To show them what they were doing wrong and how they could correct it? Did he want to cast doubt on their character? Or did he want to force them to face a very uncomfortable situation? Was his intention to hurt them or to help them? Well, friends, I can only say that they had really irritated him. But when I look at the rest of his life and the way that he related to other people, the way he related to the Pharisees, I have to say that he said those things for two reasons and two reasons only. First, he said them because they were true. And second, he said them because he wanted them to understand. And he wanted them to understand because he loved them. And because he loved them, he knew he had to take a risk at taking the tough stand and confronting them with the tough truth. Last week we discussed the necessity of loving other people with the heart of God, of being compassionate and understanding and merciful. And we live in a world where those virtues are needed now more than ever. We need to be able to extend them to those people that surround us. But if we want to build lasting relationships, if we want relationships that are healthy, then this soft-hearted love has to be tempered with a willingness to do exactly what Jesus did, to speak the truth, even when it would be easier and maybe even a little kinder to remain silent. As most of us know, this type of radical love is difficult, especially when it comes to those we love and respect. In moments when the people that are closest to us are doing things that we would rather they not do, things that may be even illegal or immoral, what is our first response? Is to remain silent, to keep the peace. Don't rock the boat. But it doesn't work. In his book, Who Are You When No One Is Looking, Bill Hybels has this to say. He says, in choosing peacekeeping over truth-telling, people think they are being noble, but in reality, they're making bad choices. Because whatever caused the tension will come back. The peace will get harder and harder to keep. A spirit of disappointment will start to flow through the peacekeeper's veins, leading first to anger, then to bitterness, and finally to hatred. Have you ever experienced it? Well, Christians, it takes courage to speak the truth, especially when we know, like Jesus, that it's simply going to make the other people angry, that it's going to upset them. But unless we are willing to take the risk, unless we are willing to place the well-being of the other person above our own comfort level, then our relationships will never flourish and grow. And yes, taking that tough stand, speaking the tough truth is hard. It means that we have to take risks, and the outcome is not always as we wish it could be. You know, the Pharisees in today's reading did not thank Jesus for his observations or for his suggestions. They didn't promise him that they were going to try to do better in the future or that they would take it under advisement. You know what they did instead? According to Matthew, these were the very last words Jesus spoke to them before they had him arrested, tried, and crucified. He knew it was going to happen, but it didn't stop him from speaking the truth, and it shouldn't stop us either. In the words of St. Paul, tell the truth to your neighbors because we are part of the same body. Be angry without sinning. Don't let any foul words come out of your mouths. Only say what is helpful to build up the community. Put aside all bitterness, losing your temper, anger, shouting, and slander. Be kind, compassionate, and forgive. Forgive in the same way that God, through Christ, has forgiven you. Live your life with love, following the example of Christ, who loves us and gave himself for us. Sometimes he was gentle. Sometimes he was tough. But always he loved. And so should we. To God be the glory. And all God's children say, Amen.